All right, I'll keep an eye on the lobby if anybody else comes in. But if you want to take it, Dennis, and kind of summarize what you've updated since. I know we haven't had a lot of time, but I know you did a little bit of work on updating what we had, and then continue the discussion. I would most likely appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Um, are you seeing this okay? Is anybody seeing this okay?
I see
We
it.
can.
Oh, good. All right. So following on from last time, all I did was some incremental refinement on the deck, trying to get to the point where we fully understood NIST's hybrid approach, which is applying zero trust principles to existing systems. Separately, how that reflected or complemented or contradicted what we're seeing from commercial folks applying zero trust principles to systems after they've been developed, which doesn't fit the zero trust model or the zero trust reference architectures that are sort of the purest or more pure implementations, and maybe the implementations associated with cloud native development and new greenfield applications. So with respect to that, I'll step through these on the way to the updated documents. You see the structure that we were headed at, a recognition of why there was a need for a hybrid approach that wasn't going to realize full zero trust, probably couldn't. It was those essential systems that may need to be re-implemented or replaced in order to be able, in CISA's words, in order to be able to meet a more comprehensive zero trust definition. The document links are all here. There are 5 fundamental objectives there. The first of the slides that I added reflects this one, is I'm trying to get a graphical representation of the requirements associated with each of the primary objectives. This is the one I added, which essentially reflects the requirements that there be an inventory of all of the data and classification of that data that's associated with the process. There be a granular expression of access control. Here I tried to represent that with the default deny red bar sweeping across the screen and point admissions of control where there's explicit allow for access between the resources and the data that needs to sit at them. Note, this is different than the pure zero trust mechanism, which would say I need this granularity not to be a generic resource of arbitrary size, but instead to be a service or a container or an application level in the more cloud-friendly sense of granularity. This isn't at that level of granularity. In 3, there was the requirement for data at rest encryption, and that is closely reflected in 4 by the data in flight encryption, which with mutual authentication. What would be really useful is, as you're looking at these diagrams and when you consider them when we're not in the middle of a meeting, think about, is this a good enough way to represent and capture those concepts? The 5th requirement is have backups of the data for a restorability mechanism. Those are just the things that were expressed in Objective 2, but I tried to make them graphical so we could see the relationship between them, but we could also get a more intuitive feel for how they might be applied to things that aren't so much the center of the NIST design space, this Kubernetes service mesh sort of application domains, when we're applying to existing systems whose development lifecycle you can't see into, whose service or supply chain has already been farmed for the parts that make up the application or the system that's under consideration. And so those things that tough to reconstruct when you didn't do it during development or construction of the systems in the first place. So this is just an application of zero trust principles, in this case following Objective 2 to existing systems, trying to capture that graphically. The next thing I added to this, I didn't get through the other objectives yet, so apologies for just not having the time to do that yet, was to begin to capture the commercial examples. So here's an example of Microsoft's recommendations on applying zero trust model and principles to existing systems. And you can see it's a much less ambitious set of both actions, the time associated with it, and the resulting capabilities that come from it. So they look hard at establishing capabilities that let you get rid of some of the problems with existing systems, recognizing you're not going to get at the development life cycle for these existing systems because that's already passed. And you're not going to necessarily retroactively create the provenance of all the components that make it up. But you can do some things that are real useful that are very consistent with zero trust. And that may build the basis for being able to say, what is the combination of the trust posture that I can elicit from this application, which uses some zero trust principles, with another that might be more completely zero trust, and what's the resulting policy and posture as a consequence. So that's the speculation. I don't have a proof for that, but I believe it establishes some common ground and that allows better alignment of policy than would occur if there were no common concepts and abstractions to connect the dots with. So I think there's a good basis for considering at least an ontological approach to describing the relationships here. Past that, you see the objectives. They're divided into two groups. Microsoft is suggesting you got to build visibility because too much blind stuff's going on there. You'd love to be able to control interactions. They suggest establishing that with APIs where you can. You've got to be able to understand what's going on with those systems that you didn't know about. And of course, what you do to get automation behind the policy so that that can be consistently reproduced and that the problem isn't the human power bandwidth in terms of running into the wall and implementing consistently and repeating and eventually improving the posture of the policy. And of course, there's some follow-on objectives that are the next step once you've done the top three. But these are far less ambitious than in 800-207, the NIST sort of definitional document. So I put the link there so you can chase it down. I'll get more. I've requested from the National Cybersecurity Centers of Excellence that Zero Trust Collaborations Group, since they have now the planned infrastructure implementation and the enterprise use cases for building out of commercial components, zero trust solutions. I'm asking that we can share that stuff with this group so that we could consider, well, maybe Oasis hosts a parallel effort that looks at doing the exact same thing, but with open capabilities, if that makes sense. Just seems like a potential fit, but it's something worth chewing on. I know we can get the information once they approve it. Whether or not we want to take off on sort of building the exemplar of how do you do zero trust on open systems, while NIST is concentrating laser-like on doing it with commercial building blocks right now, would be kind of interesting as a potential anyway, worth considering. And I think that's really it. I didn't get to do much else on that. So questions by any chance, or anything I can that you have suggestions on that would be more useful than me just continuing to fill this thing out?
Well, this is Russ. I mean, one question I continue to have, Dennis, is as you even take the Microsoft example, from I'm just thinking where we could help zero trust is visibility of how you're doing on the march to zero trust, where you're achieving it, where you're getting there, where you're not there. Yeah. I'm wondering, like in this example, right? It's hard, some of this stuff is zero trust just drives me crazy because they say, assess everything. It's like, okay, every time I've had that discussion with customers, that never happens completely. and B, how do you know when you're done? It's like, yeah. You know what I mean? So I'm just thinking of, is there thinking about, can we overlay some level of controls so we can see the visibility of the zero trust, or in this case, the partial trust, I'll call it, or yeah. I haven't got started on this system trust, that we can kind of, over time, can see better visibility of how we're doing.
So let's consider the enterprise feedback loop right after this comment, which says CISA recognized that need, which is why you have those three different rows going across this maturity model, right? The one that says where we're at now, traditional. The one that says, what is the staging point on the way to zero trust where you're still getting some benefit? What do you do as a way to begin getting there? And then optimal down on the end is you've arrived to a relatively pure version of zero trust by you seeing all those words like fully and continuous. So they're more ambitious, but they are, I won't say aspirational because there is some audit stuff controls behind it. And we can talk, I should have included those in the deck, but I'll do that next time. But you're absolutely right. Those many absolutely essential systems that will not be instantly turned into linguistic microservice implementations, those are important too. And they've got to be able to play in the game. You can't just turn them off and disconnect them. I think that is why that other set of guidance that is here was developed. It was a recognition explicitly that there are existing systems that have to operate. They still have to be made more secure than they are now, that we can't have supply chain attacks and ransomware running roughshod over these systems. So we're going to apply some zero trust principles to them. The question of what is the feedback that tells us that we're making headway? And that is a big one. Right now, MITRE is working on a risk model that is supposed to begin connecting the dots on some of the efficacy measures and some of the, how do I evaluate my supply chain participants in a consistent way, a way that lets you look across all of your suppliers and say thumbs up or thumbs down. Sean Barnum's actually quarterbacking that effort at MITRE. And he talked about it in one of our groups last week. But there isn't the, okay, how much more secure are you? The posture metrics or measures kind of number coming back the other way. NCCOE is handling that by having Mandiant use their security verifier tool, which essentially plops down some internal components, and Mandiant does their best to see, can they reach them? And that becomes an assessment of how granularly are you isolated, how fully are you isolated, what threats are uncovered, that kind of thing. It's almost like Cobalt Strike in that sense, but from a more productive way, trying to get you to understand where the gaps are in your implementation. That will be used in all of the zero trust implementations that the NCCOE is doing to give them a measure, an empirical measure, coming back the other way. So I think we could easily do that approach, that is, use a tool, maybe something like MITRE that does the simulation stuff to help find things. We might be, I don't know of a great open source tool that does the equivalent of the Mandiant verifier, but I know we could get that as a tool from them in order to be able to help do an evaluation. That almost says, go get this tool and do this measurement. And that's not what we need. What we need is really maybe describe the methodology and leave it up to the participant to decide how do they meet that need. It may be we describe to some extent what that should result in terms of the kinds of measures that you would compare. But I don't think that's been standardized yet. And even NIST is resorting to a tool to get there rather than a standardization effort to describe the efficacy of introducing zero trust. Does that make sense as at least a response?
Yeah, it certainly does. One of the thoughts I had on the tooling was, there's certainly going to be a variety of tools, I believe, based on the multiple controls we're talking about in the zero trust environment, I believe, at least the identity and data access. And so the other thought I had, Dennis, is, as you know, we have PACE, which is a great posture assessment structure that takes multiple different control points, if you will, or metrics or meters, and brings them together so you can, provide a singleized policy against it and monitor it as a composite. I'm wondering, is there a parallel there that, yeah, the Mandiant tool is one of the tools you're going to need. You can have any other you want, but its job is to do such and such, metrics or visibility that will feed into something like a PACE environment that'll allow us to gather things and centralize them. I'm thinking that way. Does that make any sense?
Well, it kind of, I think the worrisome thing about it is, of course, PACE is posture collection. And so much of zero trust is that independent verification side of the fence, which includes sort of behavioral stuff, things that aren't easily collected, sort of configuration stuff. However, it is certainly possible that PACE has a definition that steps beyond posture and gets to the verification of posture. And so when I collect something that says, here's a registry entry set a particular way, it certainly is possible for PACE to say, and I also checked the Hive to make sure my API wasn't being hooked and the registry wasn't lying to me. So I think there's some options there. There is also the fact that MITRE's using to evaluate EDR and XDR tools in terms of their coverage of the attack matrix sort of TTPs. by using tools that they build to do that. And maybe that is more available in some sense. I don't know how hard it is to run or anything like that. I'm just speculating and grasping at straws in terms of things that might be a way to test from an attack behavior resistance perspective, if that makes sense. But there still is the open question. How do I measure it? How do I know if this is better or worse than last time, than the alternative? Zero trust versus non-zero trust, partial zero trust versus non-zero trust. I think there are some compelling qualitative arguments, but they aren't quantitative. They don't do that measure things. But maybe this is worth a little bit of noodling and maybe some debate over email while we try to figure out how to move that forward. There's certainly other tools around. And I know that NSA had done at least 4 initial evaluations of the effect of zero trust approaches on security, and that was a large part of the validation that this was something for NIST to hoist the banner on. I don't know what those evaluations were, what the results, or whether we can get any insight into them. But I do know they were very positive. And it was for resisting those inside-out kinds of vulnerability exploitation where the compromise was already inside the perimeter. But there are folks we can ask. Am I still on, or?
No, you're still on. You're still on. I was giving time for the others to talk. Just to make sure I wasn't dominating this stuff.
So I'll just say, Dennis, I think the visual that you put together for the objective 2, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. I think it's, I think as we go back and reference the statements, I think it's a pretty clear visual representation. So
please don't hesitate if you've got any instincts on improving it or alternative visualizations. This, visualization is kind of a personal thing. It would make sense to somebody.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think when I just initially looked at it, it didn't jump out at me, but as you kind of walked through, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
That reminds me, I need to do speaker notes then.
Actually, that's a good idea. Yeah. So I don't know. I think so. Yeah, just commenting on that. I think thanks for pulling that together. I think that looks good.
Delighted. So Dave, this make you want to vomit, or is it okay?
I'm here as a fly on the wall. I hadn't been following this closely. I was interested whether Brian Salk, after contacting OCA, ever followed up after that first contact. But so no, I agree that defining APIs and and validating the data that goes through them is definitely useful. I don't know whether this diagram is doing any protocol validation or just doing data in flight.
Yeah, not at all. This one just reflects that objective 2 list of 5 statements. So all I was trying to do is create a graphical analog of the preceding slide on this one. The Microsoft guidance is trying to be more comprehensive and refer to tools that you can actually buy, right? Because what they wanted was their guidance to turn into something very actionable for their customer base. And so they had to connect the dots to other stuff. In the NCCOE effort, you see that a lot. You see a lot of references to specific products being used in specific combinations, even across vendors, in order to try to determine how close can they get to zero trust reference architecture implemented in existing available stuff. But I don't see anybody doing exactly the same thing with the open side of the fence. And that may be an open opportunity, place to play, but it does sound complex. If we can get the NCCOE documentation on what's the infrastructure look like and what is the reference architecture looking like after chewing on this, we may be able to find open analogs to each and every one of the building block components. And if that's true, we may be able to make some headway. And that could be very, very cool. But that would be cool to me. It doesn't mean it's cool to everybody. So.
You've just got 5 times as much energy as anybody else I know.
Sorry, too much espresso.
Yeah.
All right, well, do chew on it offline, and I'll send out a separate copy, maybe in the next couple of days, with speaker notes on what I would say in 3 sentences about each of the slides, to add a little more context. And if there's any part of this that you think needs to be adjusted or corrected, please don't hesitate. There's only an attempt to catalyze things. I have no ego invested in this. I'll do anything to improve it. And Russ,
Thank you very much for doing what you did, Dennis. It's really helpful.
Yeah, Dennis, can you remind me? And I know we talked about this last time, so my apologies. But Thanksgiving and all that stuff has rotted my brain. After we go through these steps, what was the next thing that we were thinking of doing as like follow on?
So I think the only point of this was to try to laser in on what was that partial zero trust, that hybrid zero trust thing that NIST made reference to in the definition, and how does it apply to systems, and so that we could feel comfortable about deciding, is that something we want to formalize, possibly in a more general approach, because NIST is doing this with those practice guides, which will only refer to the commercial collaborators parts. And that's probably not a good thing for the market to only have that guidance sitting there in terms of sort of the commercial participants in the stuff, because almost every one of those commercial components has alternatives that exist in the open environment, if that makes sense, including the ones in our portfolio. And there's also not, there's nothing uniform about it. Almost nobody is either all commercial components or all open source, right? So there's going to be lines where we really want a more continuous application of the kinds of technology. So Russ, back over to you.
All right. Again, thanks so much for preparing everything, Dennis. I will call. This is our last meeting of the year. I will send out new email notices and webinar information in January when we all get back from our wonderful long vacations, which I'm looking forward to. And if anybody's got any thoughts and ideas, what's percolating in my head is I'm trying to figure out a good target for us to achieve. This is great research work, but it would be nice if we could define a really nice, clear target of what we want to achieve, and what kind of deliverable we're thinking about creating, whether it's a reference architecture, whether it's a white paper, I don't know, whatever you think it could be. I'm looking for input from anybody on the team to what could be a reasonable target that we can chew away at and drive to, because I feel like what we're doing right now with Dennis, which is great, is a research section here, just looking around, checking things out, see what the state of the art is, which is great, but it's not getting us to the second step, which is what do we want to get through and achieve with the OCA in terms of what we could offer in the open space. So love any input on that. Send an email to me. I'll be happy to collect all that, and we can talk about it in the next meeting. And Dennis, keep carrying on the reference material, because we'll get smarter through you on some of these things, and see if we can as you said, evolve to some of these things. So there's a natural place where we could help, given the current lay of the land. That's also a very helpful way of looking at it. So I like it.
I think we'll also start getting some feedback on what's working and what's not as people attempt to grapple with this, and how disruptive, pure approach would be.
Yes, I think so.
So, I'm wondering, what's going through my head now is looking at the diagrams that Dennis is putting together for the first objective 1 and objective 2. If there's if there's some kind of an overlay with those, meaning in a new world, in a pure zero trust world, I guess, like, what are the technologies, or what are the options that are available to fulfill those requirements versus what doesn't, like kind of explicitly calling out what doesn't work in a traditional or legacy or hybrid world.
Yeah, that's a good idea. The gap analysis between a pure approach and the hybrid approach is why is there a hybrid approach is another way to phrase that. And also, why don't I take a stab for the next time at summarizing what I think the differences are, what seem to be the differences. You guys can keep me honest on that, or add to it. And we use that as sort of understanding both what the difference is and maybe the why. I think, for example, that aggressive granular segmentation, try doing that on an existing SAP environment, right? It's not going to happen without cutting essential dependencies and communications paths. And so I think there are some like that that begin to jump out, that if you don't do it from in the inception of design, then it becomes really hard to retrofit. And those are the ones that seem to stick out to me the most. But that doesn't
Okay, cool.
securing the system's any less essential.
No, exactly. And then I think maybe that helps us get into what Russ was poking at there too, of, hey, and then maybe we can turn that into a white paper with guidance for those environments of what are the alternatives then that you need to look at. Yeah,
it's amazing to me that wasn't explicitly handled in the discussion from NIST. And I'm just not sure why they didn't tackle juxtaposing those two and instead just published the two documents in isolation.
Okay, cool. Yeah, again, Dennis, thanks. And let us know how, like, I don't want to make this, just your homework, your assignments, right? So however we can all help and collaborate.
Yeah, maybe before the next meeting, we could have sort of an informal discussion where we could, I'll put together the stuff I have ahead of that, and then maybe use that as a chat to get some additional bandwidth and consideration before these meetings, so that it's not completely cold.
That sounds great. Yeah, we can use the email channel if you want as a way to get this across.
So if I reply to this mail list, I'm good in this contact mechanism.
Yep.
And that's right. That everybody on this list here is on that one.
Alrighty.
Very good. Again, thanks everybody. Have a great vacation holiday, and we will zoom in the new year.
You too, Russ. Thank you.
Great. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.